We work, we live, we innovate, and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
Scientific discoveries show that your brain can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point. The Center for Brain Health can show you how to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
We learned from a national poll that 95% of people want to do something about their brains. The problem is they don't know where or how to start. At the Center for Brain Health, we have easy-to-use, scientifically proven tools to provide people a proactive path to do just that, to help people everywhere improve their quality of life through brain health. What's exciting is that it's easy to start, and starting is urgent because we are in a brain health crisis.
So how do you boost your brain power? How can better brain health help you focus on what's most important?
Brain training is a part of the way that we would distinguish ourselves from others. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be commonplace in businesses in years to come.
We are seeing an epidemic of mental health concerns. Stress and overload lead to depression, anxiety, and burnout. Our brains hold the key to navigate these hurdles. It's never too soon to start.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Research shows training middle schoolers how to think, problem solve, and innovate significantly improves academic achievement. Even more importantly, it enhances confidence and well-being for them to thrive throughout their lives.
It really helps the kid and it builds their stamina. I genuinely credit my success in the classroom from this program.
The key to the future is stronger brain health for individuals and communities. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Welcome. It starts here, the Brain Health Revolution, and January for our first of the year, Frontiers of Brain Health. You're going to be so thrilled that you came. We've had the good fortune of getting to interact and meet with Dr. Dominic Trépel, our speaker today, and we feel like we're lost souls that have now found our soul together, so it's going to be a wonderful time. Here at the Center for Brain Health, we just welcome you in terms of everything, and we've got some people joining us remote where we can dig into the science in a deep way, make you curious and want to learn more. So please put your questions in your mind and ask them as we go. My name is Dr. Sandy Bond Chapman. I'm the founder and chief director of the Center for Brain Health and a professor in the School of Behavioral and Brain Science here at the University of Texas at Dallas. We'll have a few minutes to answer questions. Dr. Trépel is going to try to finish in 45 minutes, so get your curious questions go in the Q&A if you're online, and we'll have time for questions here because I know what a curious audience that we have. For those of you that don't know about us that are online, the Center for Brain Health is dedicated to defining what is brain health, to measuring how can we measure the most complex organ and what it produces in the world, how can we improve it, and how can we scale it so that we can reach every single individual. So welcome to our world. We want you to be part of it. At the end of this, you're going to hear about our landmark study, the Brain Health Project, and I hope you will not miss a day before you care about your own brain. So it is my good fortune to introduce Dominic Trépel. He's joining us from Trinity College, Dublin. And what's exciting, you've most of you have his bio from what we sent out, so I'm not going to go into that in detail, but we were introduced to Dr. Trépel from one of our collaborators, Dr. Ian Robertson, who's also at Trinity University. And when we were talking about, we want to figure out what is it that could benefit our world if we help people keep their brain skills stronger, longer. What would be the economic impact, the brainomics of it? And Dr. Robertson says, in his wonderful Scottish accent, I think you need to meet, and of course that's not Irish, Dr. Trépel, because he has a team of 10 experts that are working on the health of, the economics of brain health. Where in the world could our two like minds come together except through the connections and the rich collaborations? The conversations that we have, I want each of you to think of in your world, if you could make brain health better, what would be the economic impact? And let's get started thinking about what that can be. Please join me in welcoming the esteemed Dr. Trépel.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, and thank you so much. I've truly experienced Texan hospitality over the last few days. I want to thank everyone that's here that I've met with and got to learn so much about it. Coming here is like meeting a long-lost cousin, because I work with the Global Brain Health Institute, and we've also been talking a lot about brain health. So to share the narratives and to compare notes and to discover a program looking at the economics of brain health has taken me from being someone who's looking at this in isolation or with my team to having colleagues to compare notes with over, I hope, the next many years. So thank you. So the topic I wanted to bring for discussion today is around the economics of brain health, because I think everyone in here will probably be in agreement that it's an emerging market. It's something that I think that people are increasingly seeing value on, and we are probably a select few here, but I can see over the next decade or two, this is going to become something that's in everyone's mind, just like we think about going to the gym. So we will all be very happy to invest in improving our brain health. So as Dr. Chapman suggested, I wanted to put that same thought experiment with you. What makes you value your brain? And I think that's always a very individual question. We've asked that question a few times over the last few days, and everyone has had such an interesting answer to give to that. And if we don't get to discuss all your ideas, please do reach out to me and share your ideas by email as they come. So make notes as we go along. Okay, so let's start from basics. So what is economics? So I always like to start not assuming any knowledge of economics. And I always like to highlight economics by telling you all that I have 4 kids. My 4 kids, they have unlimited wants. But they don't realize poor dad has only limited resources. So we slowly, over time, they're getting better now, actually. They understand there's a need to make choices about what you want and the budget means you can afford. So that's really just a very simple starting point for this. Okay, so most of economics thinks about markets. And most of us can relate to markets, right? We all are consumers. We would buy a TV or a car. So what I'm showing here is usually we go into a shop and say if we're buying a TV, we know what we want. We say it has to be so big, it has to be around this right price, maybe there's some technological advancements. We kind of understand the purchasing arrangement, and we go through a transaction with the purchaser. That's how most markets work. Okay, but I'm a health economist, so what's different? What's going on different there? So I want to quickly bring you into my world. So the market for health, what is that? Well, it's not the same, is it? We don't go in somewhere and buy some health, right, and then walk away and say, oh, I've got a bit more health that I need. We have this arrangement where we are either a patient, just a general person in the public, or sometimes a carer. And those are really the consumers. Those are people who have a vested interest in improving their health status a lot of the time. And then we have providers, okay? So we can think about what all those people be, doctors, nurses, public health physicians, all sorts of things like that. And I think who provides and who has an invested interest in improving health is increasing now, okay? But the difference with the health market is, firstly, on the consumer side, there's unpredictability. We never know when we're going to get sick, right? So it's a critical good. When we don't, when we're not well, we're suddenly very aware of our lack of health. And so it has an unpredictable demand, okay? Whereas if we compare it to the TV, we know when we're going to want a new TV, okay? On the supplier side, services are not a physical good. We can't pick it up and go, yeah, that's a good doctor, you know? Okay, so this means that we cannot test what we find. So we just have to entrust ourselves to whatever arrangement exists, okay? So the next complication is we don't usually control, unless you're in an environment where you pay out of pocket, which is usually a lower income setting, we usually have some sort of other arrangement for payment. So we have this third party, and they make decisions about what we can get. So it's a really quite an odd market, right? Okay, so I was just thinking about this morning. This Kenneth Arrow, Nobel Prize winner, he produced one of the seminal papers in health economics in 1963. 60 years ago, I just realized. So our discipline started 60 years ago with really this person who talked about asymmetries of information in the market. One of these three parties that we see here have more information than another a lot of the time, right? So that adds to some of the further what we call specific market failures, okay? So even normal markets fail, but these are specific ones to health. So the solution often is to improve what we know, to improve information. So I'm sure there's lots of researchers in the room, and what you're doing is, in some ways, improving the way the system runs, okay? So that was 60 years ago, but let me tell you about the paradigm now. What's happened in the last 60 years? So now it's become a very multidisciplinary subject. So what we try to do is have people sit at the table, and we've sat at a few tables, if I can look around the room, people, and we've compared notes, and you've got a little bit of an insight into what I'm like, kind of questioning how you're thinking and how you're approaching your science. Okay, so that's, I take the example from the UK of the NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research, who generally will only commission research nowadays if there's an economist involved. So there has to be value for money demonstrated for any research that's getting commissioned. It's a real paradigm shift. It's really started to have an impact on the systems as a whole, which is sometimes a limitation without it. The other thing I just want to quickly highlight, and I won't go into this, maybe you can find out about this a bit more elsewhere, is we also now really encourage members of the general public to be involved in research, to be like a stakeholder and to tell us what they think. And sometimes it's a complicated discussion, but it really kind of helps to make research much more multidisciplinary. Okay. And before that, when research was solely driven by a single people and not a multidisciplinary approach, my view is we had one hand tied behind our back. The potential for impact was limited. So I want to start off by sharing some of my research, which I think is a real interesting one to share with this audience. This is, I think, adds weight to the brain health hypothesis. Working with colleagues in Sweden, Sweden has an amazing set of routinely collected data. And the interesting thing is, when you go to the doctor in Sweden, they don't ask you your name, they ask you for a number. If you go to the school, they ask you for a number, then they ask you your name. So you can link with these numbers so many things. So this is a culmination of a load of different data sets that were merged, and we were able to look at people over 17 years who were diagnosed with dementia. So we were able to look at them 10 years before their diagnosis. And what this shows, interesting, if you look, we have a similarly matched population, which shows their aggregate healthcare costs 10 years before diagnosis compared to people who later developed dementia. And you can see significant difference 10 years before in their costs. That means something is happening before, which I think really provides a lot of weight to the brain health hypothesis. Okay, so in terms of talking to policymakers who are saying, well, it's something when the disease comes, let's get going then. No, we're going to flip this. We're going to start talking 10 years or more before, and hopefully the world will adapt to this. I want to point out another thing. People talk about dementia costing 1 trillion or 2 trillion around the world. Actually, look, the costs after diagnosis drop very quickly. So in actual fact, for some people, you can see compared to the general population, they go below. So I show the gender divide here because it's very interesting that women, it's not significant, but you can see a non-significant difference in the costs. And this is based on 21,000 people, so it's quite good data. So there's a lot of things to be considering there. So really the opportunities are before diagnosis. And I want to focus on, we do a lot of work on dementia, but I also want to keep the discussion around brain health today. So just please bear that in mind. So just segueing into what motivates us at the Global Brain Health Institute, we've got a very strong mission around dementia. And so a lot of discussion has been about modifiable risk factors, which I'm sure many people in the room might have heard this discussion. So, sorry, this slide here was produced by the Lancet Commission, who were thinking about opportunities throughout life to intervene and reduce the risks of people developing dementia. And I would say opportunities for better brain health, actually. So this is motivating a lot of our work. So I want to now take you to what we do as economists in there. So a lot of the time, the world just reaches an equilibrium in terms of how things are arranged. In healthcare, what you're seeing here is a production frontier, and I've mentioned this to a few people over the last few days. We're quite comfortable in C. We just spend more than we need to because we kind of feel reassured that we're covering our bases, right? At the other end of it, if you look at A, this is a place where the benefits have not been realized yet. And so historically, with dementia, and I think now with this emerging field of brain health, we're in A. There's everything to gain here. If we can get up the curve, that's great. But the people that are in C, there's a load of extra expenditure there that's not necessary. They actually need to be closer to B because that's where the plateau is kind of starting. So they just need to get closest to the flat. So we talk about displacement, trying to get some of those resources going into the A quadrants, okay? So I'm going to give you an example of this. So this is not my data now. This is something I've borrowed. But it was looking at research spending, cancer versus chronic heart disease, stroke, and dementia. And for every 10, now this is a UK study, so we're talking in pounds now. For every 10 pounds that it costs for the disease, there was a ratio of how much was going into research. For cancer, it's £1.08, so around £1 in every 10 was going back into research to keep this going. And we'll look at a bit of data later on how cancer looks in terms of the overinvestment. But they're very much on the C now. They're getting marginal improvements. There's definitely lots of treatments coming in, but life extensions are starting to come quite minimal. So, but it's absorbing so much money around the world. Whereas for dementia, this is now 10 years old, this study, but for dementia, it's 13 times lower compared to the burden of the disease. Okay, so that really talks to us about that could be something that we could be thinking about displacing. So let me just bring you into how we approach the world. I started you off thinking about a market, right? But we also think in terms of a factory model. You get some bits, resources that you need to, for example, make the TV. You then put them in the factory, someone assembles them, and then you output other number of TVs you produce. That's our general paradigm, okay? So in health, we think about the process as the services. The inputs can be things like resources, budgets, and ultimately what it costs, so how much budget needs to go into different areas. And when we think about outputs, as economists, we've had to redefine things, because we don't produce TVs. We want systems to produce health. So we need to operationalize that in terms of things we can produce. I'll explain a little bit about what these are later on, but the most simplest one are things like generic health, and we measure that in quality-adjusted life years. But it can also be at a wider economy level, productivity. So I think which is a very important argument for brain health. And it can also be even further our general level of well-being and happiness. Sound's going off a little bit there. I'll try standing back a bit. Okay, so all these things are possible things that if we're entrusting our money to someone else, we'd be happy if they kind of demonstrate that they can produce as much of that as they can, right? Okay, so how we approach this. So this is our secret weapon in economics. We try to, when we're working with decision makers for resources, keep things very simple with a cost to benefit ratio. So when we're doing health studies, we tend to, a lot of people here will know effectiveness studies, right? So things that come from trials. And we try to compare to what the usual arrangement is in society. Usual care if it's a health intervention, to some novel intervention. So that would be your effectiveness one. And we try to establish the cost of the two. And then by working out this ratio, we're able to kind of give a statement on the value for money. And I'll show you some examples of those. So that first thing I was just mentioning about quality-adjusted life years. So in health, we have a health-related quality of life. So what our health contributes to us being able to maintain a good quality of life. And we'd like to think about this as incremental. So if we have a usual arrangement and we like to try and work out what the additional health gains are from a brain health intervention, right? You can see this area under the curve here. So the grayed out area is without treatment and with treatment. And that extra bit is what we're producing as a result of it. And then we've got to work out, is it worth paying for? So then we have to work out what things cost. So the total costs are not just the intervention cost. If we do something in health, things change elsewhere as well. So we have to make an initial investment, but perhaps lots of money gets saved elsewhere. And I won't spoil the story, but I'll show you a few examples later on. So here's a quick example of a study that I think some people were interested in here, which is looking at, it was 2 trials under one funding stream called CASPER and CASPER+. CASPER was looking at sub-threshold depression. So I think it's a really interesting story to come to think about things that aren't a clinical diagnosis yet, but what happens if we intervene? And because this was done in York, where people are very good at being frugal and stretching out the money, we were able to get 2 trials out of 1. So we were able to then look at the therapeutic level depression and compare some of the very interesting features of that. So let me show you firstly what we do. So this is the first bit of how much does it cost to do an intervention. So the intervention was CBT. I'm sure lots of people in the room are familiar with that. But to make sure that it was as effective when left in the real world setting, hands off, this is what we want you to do, and then we just compare whether it works. It's a policy experiment in many respects. What we had to do is make it case management collaborative care, which meant that there was a lot of extra resources to make sure it was done as well as possible and monitored and followed up, and so that people didn't slip through the cracks. And we also had a very strong data environment where everything that happened to the people in this study was captured. And what you're looking at here is a really interesting example of about 500 people and whether or not they were taking the intervention. So what you can see first of all is some people, as is shown here, right, tried it, didn't like it, moved on, right? But the interesting thing, there was another half of the population that had this, right, we're going to stick with what the doctors are asking us to do here. And they delivered against that. And this is a sub-threshold population. So you might be saying, well, maybe some of those people didn't need the services. They didn't really have real depression. So let's move on a little bit now. We looked at the depressive population, and we see exactly the same picture there. You'd think that actually that tail at the other end would get smaller because people had more severe disease. Actually, it got bigger. So when we look at this part that looks like a normal distribution, we can see, yes, the people who had a lower level of health need had an average less use of services compared to those that did. So you can see the people with more severe depression use more services. However, maybe this is intuitive to some of us who think about depression. The people discontinued, there's actually higher rates of people discontinuing. So it points us towards almost a rational decision-making process, that where people are not continuing with services, they're more likely to not continue. So some really interesting data that comes out from the economics there. The other half of the equation is downstream costs. So let me just quickly touch on that. So we measure the intervention, but then we also measure what happens when we leave them alone, when over the next year or two, what are they using? A lot of people look at economists and say, save us money. But in actual fact, what you can see here, the data, is people start to use services more. And the intuition that came out from that is the depressed or sub-therapeutically depressed population just engage the services more appropriately. I should say this is in the NHS, so there are some differences that you might want to consider when you kind of generalize it to an American audience. Okay, so coming back to this ratio. So we're then able to put this data together about quality adjusted life years and costs and work all this out. And then this is a decision tool. So if you imagine, if things are in the the top left quadrant, right, they're less effective and costing you more. Your decision's very straightforward, isn't it? You're not going to do that. It's not giving you anything more. On the other hand, if it's in the bottom right quadrant, it's more effective and it's saving you money. Why would you, the origin at 0, is usual care. Why would you continue doing what you're doing? Okay, so it's a really simple, straightforward, powerful tool. Most of the time, things fall in the top right quadrant, where it's more expensive, but it also requires more money. And then we have to have decision rules about how much we're willing to pay for an extra health gain. So it brings us back to this displacement idea. So if we have to make decisions on how to improve our systems, this is quite a good way to find the inefficiencies and move towards something that's a better way to produce overall health. To give you an international perspective, this is happening all over the world. These are just guidelines from all over the world, and this is actually very old. It's probably twice as many there. So all over the world, people are adopting these frameworks, and they're very common in pharmaceutical regulation, but they're becoming increasingly common for non-pharmacological approaches, how health systems spend their money. So I'm going to come now to the economics of brain health, now that you've had this. And this is a summary of all, this is work in progress, but this gives you a sense of all of the economic evaluations in the world and who has contributed them that apply this framework to dementia. Okay, so you can see that the UK, which is a very cost-contained environment, they have to do things that improve efficiency the whole time, produce the most. And I'm not being biased there as a former Londoner. But the States also produces a lot, which is fascinating because there is legislation in the States that for FDA and Medicare that prohibits the use of cost per quality approaches. But there's still a very strong drive to use this framework to make better informed decisions. As academics, I hope you'll join me in saying, well, there's probably room for improvement there. But we can talk about that over lunch if you have other opinions. So let me break that down a little bit. I'm interested in the production process here. So this is how we've been producing economic evaluations in this space over the last 20 years. And they're in pharmacological areas, non-pharmacological areas, management approaches, and identification, which I'm saying now is an opportunity for early intervention and brain health. This is abysmal. Let me just put it this way. Compared to other areas of health, we're not producing enough evidence in this space. So we're not really improving the systems for the people that ultimately should benefit. But this is a call to action for me. This is why I'm publishing this data, is that it's setting a line in the sand and saying, in the next 20 years, this should completely change because we've got to redistribute a lot of that effort. And it brings us back to this idea of displacement, as I was just saying. Okay, so let me give you a quick snapshot. You saw the cost effectiveness plane, this idea of the 4 quadrants. Look at this. So pharmaceuticals, look at the number that fall in the bottom right quadrant. So the take-home message here is if you do anything, you improve health, and you're very likely to save money at the same time. So anything that improves the situation of people with dementia is fantastic. I'll come on to some of the emerging evidence on that as more pre-diagnosis in a little while. Okay, but I'm going to use these. I'm going to tell you about the non-pharma stuff, and I'm going to just give you some examples as I go through these. So I wanted to kind of show you what's happening around the world with the drug market quickly, because I'm sure lots of you know that there are lots of drugs coming through in this dementia space. But overall, the spend around the world is 1.27 trillion on therapies, of which 99.5 billion go to oncology products, probably 1 or 2 as well. So it's a very dominated market. There's lots of opportunity there for things that are going to improve our brains. This is the market historically for dementia products around the world. I won't go into much detail, but again, largely over this side of the world. No surprise. And then we know that there's a series of monoclonal antibodies coming through to market, which I'm sure, again, if people want to talk about, there are people in the States looking at the regulatory environment for that. They don't have, like in the UK, where legislation says if it isn't cost effective, we won't fund it. Here, the FDA make decisions without that. So you're seeing products coming out for $55,000 at the moment, which is appalling if you ask me. There's zero chance of them being cost effective, even if they worked really well. So, yeah, as I was saying, we don't use economic appraisal. Now, the reason I make that story is this is the pipeline. I don't know how many people have seen this. This is in Alzheimer's and dementia and produced every year. There's going to be lots of action in this space. So we can't keep on letting people come to market with those price tags. And just that's the one point I want to make there. And I'm not really into pharmaceuticals. There's a whole industry of health economists that go into that. And I was just explaining why I don't go onto LinkedIn, because they're trying to pull me into that area. So that's the pharmacological, and I want to now segue onto talking about non-pharmacology, which is a passion of mine. I love things that are non-pharmacologically related, which I think is a shared interest here. Not much there, right? Also, an interesting difference, these tend to all be real-world studies where the pharmacological ones are all simulations based on evidence that they like to put forward that supports their case, whereas these ones definitively show things. So there might not be many, but when there is one, you can really trust them. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a model study that I did of physical activity in reducing the risks of Alzheimer's disease. And this is just to give you an N of 1, another one that's contributing into this literature. And this was done with a couple of colleagues from Sheffield University and one from Bristol. And what we've done is we've simulated if we intervene into life at a mild cognitive impairment stage with physical activity, is it cost effective? Okay, and this bunch of dots in the top right-hand corner, right, is part of that cost effectiveness plan. You can see it's more expensive, obviously, but it produces good amount of health. And so the bottom right, where you have this willingness to pay, is if we increase how much we're willing to pay, what's the probability of being cost effective? So in the UK, we'll pay about 20 to 30,000 for a QALY gain. And so you can see that there's a probability of it being cost effective at the higher threshold of 89%, which is, if you were a betting man, you would take those odds, right? So that's how we approach this. Okay, so management approaches. Again, very scant. Need for lots more work here. Again, and I hope I'm calling to action a lot of people in this room who might be doing trial-related work. Just want to show you one of the trials that we're doing in Ireland at the moment, which is in nursing homes with people who are post-diagnosis, and how I incorporate an economic evaluation. I think I've suggested to a few people in the room how to incorporate this in. It's very simple. If you want to do some sort of trial, please just email me and I'll give you what you need. Don't miss the opportunity to collect some extra data that could allow you to do some of this work. So there's two phases that we do for this. To get it right, firstly we do a feasibility randomized controlled trial, where we really design and make sure when we have this thing that we leave happening in the real world, it's as efficient as it can be. And the second part of that, to work out what's going to be efficient, we simulate what those people will do. And then we go to a stage, as is shown on the right, where we ask the funders for a definitive study, which costs usually 5 times more, in the millions, whereas this would be a couple of 100,000. Okay, so that just gives you an insight into how we design these things. Okay, so identification. I want to tell you about a model that collaborators in Scotland and I have been working on. So I talk about identification as an opportunity for early intervention. And I think that's really hopefully we all agreed, that's what brain health is about, right? It's trying to find those opportunities before we get to a diagnosis. Okay, so this is an example that Craig Ritchie and I collaborated on. There's a paper produced on this that you can look up. And it's about a service model, something that isn't healthcare. It's meant to exist in the high streets. Who's had their blood pressure checked, right? Those kind of scenarios. Why don't we get our brain health checked? So the model in Scotland, it's a smaller population, more nimble and able to do that, has pushed forward for having this. And this is something that's actually happening now. So we really presented the blueprint for this. It still has a long way to go to become a real thing, but it's started and there's commitment towards it. So what we did with the economics is I had a student come and build a simulation around how would this work. And what we're looking at here, I think a lot of people have said, maybe we need to talk about well-being. So the nice thing that Derek did with this study is he did look at a brain health model producing not QALYs, but well-being. And you can see what his estimates suggest is the incremental increase in well-being on the right-hand side. So again, this isn't QALYs, but it's well-being, but a very similar kind of decision tool. You can see it falls in the top right-hand quadrant. But because this is a simulation, there's a lot of information coming from various ideas based on what we know. And we're not there yet. We don't have a great data. So what this is telling us is the likelihood. You can see the scatter of the uncertainty falling into the right-hand quadrant. That's telling us about, what probability is it that it might not be effective, because it's going left to right, not up top to bottom, where it might be more expensive or less expensive. And so we can then use these models to work out what do we need to know. So on the right-hand side, you've got the expected value of parameter information. So all the different sources of information that go into the model, we can assign value to them and say, where should we direct our research in the future? So that really helps us to start efficiently moving in the right direction. Okay. So just going to pick up the pace a little bit. This is an aggregate of what's happening in prevention. So this is something that I put together. Just some of it is from the National Institute for Health and Clinical Health and Care Excellence, which is a UK body that looks at cost-effectiveness evidence. Some of them are produced by members of the Lancet Commission, and some of them are my results. And you can see that these are not done perfectly, but you can see there's a lot of things happening in this space, and year on year, we're going to see this updating. So this piece of work that I've been presented is we're positioning as a compendium that will update every other year to tell us how our knowledge of what needs to happen and where we should invest will improve. Okay, so I want to quickly switch and tell you a little bit about some other work that we're doing, which is, again, early opportunities for intervention. So we're looking also through the Global Brain Health Network and colleagues from Spain at dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease. These are populations which are very interesting, generally tend to be concentrated in South America, where they have a genetic predisposition to develop diseases. Right, so this is some of the phenotype differences. And the interesting thing when we think about the economics is the age of onset, because that tells us about the economic implications. If you're in your 60s, 70s, and you get dementia, you probably have finished working, right? You've retired, whatever. But these people may be bringing up kids and things like that. So the economic implications are vast. So I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about productivity, because I think with brain health, that's an interesting discussion. So our hypothesis is there is specific economic consequences. And I'm sure that just putting a little bit of thought to it, you could kind of come up with the same as what we have. Firstly, early onset, so typically before 60. Also, there's differences in the progression and the likelihood. So people with certain genetic phenotypes for this dyad population have a 100% probability of developing the disease. And also, so we've got to then think about, I want to talk to you a bit about productivity. These are people that we'd likely think need to be participating in the labor force. You know, they've still got jobs, still got families to raise. They're less likely to retire. They're going to have to carry on, right? The other thing is, if they do have, they need to have early retirement. The pension systems aren't ready for that. They don't know how to deal with that. So there's specific economic implications. And there's going to be also lots of spillover effects. So they may still go to work, and they may have a friction of trying to maintain that or not. So I use this figure here. Has anyone seen these pictures before? Yeah, right, they're beautiful, right? But this talks to me about something we call presenteeism. I'm still trying to work, I just can't do my job as well. This is an artist doing self-portraits. And you can see the progression of his ability to do something that he's repeated many times, diminishing. Isn't it a fascinating way to think about, you know, that loss in ability to produce what you wanted to do before? Okay. So I'm just going to kind of winding up a little bit here. So we've been doing a lot of application of health economics, but we've also come to the stage now with the work we're doing is we're starting to question whether what Kenneth Arrow and this is also Grossman, these are kind of seminal papers in health economics, do they apply equally as well to the brain? Because back in those days, we were probably less reliant on our cognition, and whereas the world is shifting. So what we're trying to do is take those and test them for places where it doesn't work. So what Grossman initially showed is that he defined health as a key component of human capital. What does that mean? So human capital is something that contributes to the gross domestic product of the country. So like, you know, the group of people that in this room, you're contributing, right? So you're all human capital in many respects. So Grossman defined health as a capital, and a person would have a stock of health. You know, so you can imagine that with the market model back 50 years ago. And we can, interestingly, consume but also produce health. That might sound very logical now, but when we were trying to define the market for healthcare, that was an important thing. We can take a vested interest in producing our own stock of health, and we also, over time, consume it. So we can increase our investment by time, effort, and knowledge. That's an important point. And so I'm trying to give you a quick insight. This is a very mathematical paper, and I won't show you algebra because it will terrify a lot of you. So this is just an intuition. It's still a little bit complicated, but stick with me. Imagine that you have a budget constraint at the bottom right-hand quadrant, and you could make decisions whether to invest that solely on anything else but health, buying TVs, new cars, all those kind of things, or solely on health. So let's look at that. I'm going to spend all of my money on things that I need for the household. That's going to produce a variety of things I can consume in that position. Now we could, press the wrong button there. We could do the same. We can do the same if, that moved very quickly there, for investing all of our resources in health. That will produce us a certain amount of health, right? But then we can't do either, right? So we're going to be somewhere in between. So what we end up with when we run this is a variety of scenarios that produces a production possibility frontier, okay? So that's all the possible ways that we could produce health. Now, we've then got to work out at an individual level, what do we want? How much of either do we want? So we make a trade-off between the two, and that's dictated by something we call utility in economics. So let's bring that in. So we have something called an indifference curve, which intercepts, and then that point there is where the utility is maximum from things that we consume, like new TVs and all those kind of things, to the amount of health we have, right? So we're kind of thinking about expanding this framework into brain health now. How do we trade off all the other things that we do? So that's kind of the theory that we're challenging. So I want to introduce you to just a couple of members on the team for this. So we have a project called the Economics of Brain Health, which has a cousin over here. And this is Men and Dan, who are two of the students, PhD students. One of the challenges in this area is lots of economists, they want to go into places where they can earn a lot of money very quickly. Right, so when they go into health, they usually go into where they can earn a lot of money very quickly, which is cancer, as you've seen. It's a much more buoyant market. So part of my challenge is to encourage people like this to invest in this area. So these are two people I hope you will all welcome if you meet them, because they're fantastic. Both of them have years of experience in economics, and they're capstoning that with their PhDs now. They're not following the usual student pathway in some respects. So to highlight some of Dan's work, this is again work by James Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize winning health economist, which is looking at the origins of health. And this is now kind of trying to think about the change in the framework, because we have to take a life course view of this stuff. So the data is now at an individual level, but also time series over time, and there's lots of different attributes of that. So I'm not going to go into the algebra in too much details, but I said I would show you the work that we're doing there. Okay, but underlying that is some things that you would feel are very intuitive. We're thinking about why would people change their behaviors? What's their personality traits? What are the choices driven by? And so we're hoping that a great thing to use for this, we were talking about dementia prevention, but I'm going to walk away today with the Brain Health Index. So hopefully Daniel will be able to work with some of the people in this room to think about that. Really what we're trying to hopefully set out as a mission is a mindset for change, to put value in your brains. Okay, so my job is capacity building a lot of the time. I'm trying to harness people from all over the world. We're very fortunate through the GBHI network that we're trying to tap into countries all over the world, particularly in low and middle income settings, and make sure that we aren't taking as long to achieve certain things that we've managed to achieve elsewhere. Okay, I want to just highlight a lot of other projects that are going on. I'm just going to leave those up for you to read. Most of my work is in mental health, the brain injury. Some of the people that are doing work like that have been there. But there's always an opportunity to add more. We're very collaborative in our field. So if anyone ever has any questions or see things up here that they'd like to discuss, we can do the deeper dive. But this is really just trying to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour to give you an insight into our thinking. So I'm going to turn back to you as an audience now. And I want to prime you all with this question. What makes you value your brain? Thank you. And it's always good when you say you're going to do 40 minutes and you do 41.
You did brilliant. Oh my gosh. Don't you see why he's so important to us? Change your mindset, value your brain. If we could help every single person value your brain, what would that value be? We're so grateful you're here. So, questions. What's your curious mind coming up with?
I have too many questions. Can I start? By the way, hello. Testing, testing.
Just keep talking.
Testing, 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 testing. I'll just talk more loudly, which is never a problem for me.
So there are people joining remotely, and I promise to
Here we
remind
go.
everyone just to wait to get to
Yep.
the microphone. So
Here we go.
Okay, great.
Have you seen any studies where countries, communities have tried to make health sexier, right? And I mean, think of a controversial prospect of saying insurance companies should fund inexpensive primary care and should not fund expensive end-of-life care that becomes expensive because you haven't done the former. That would turn society on its head. But have you seen any kind of studies that are even broaching that kind of topic? Because we throw money in the insurance bin and expect them to do it for us without having agency.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Who in the room does yoga? Anyone? Now look at those. How many hands, right? And that, I'm going to quote you, make sexier, right? We're all thinking about our physicality. In York, we were doing randomized controlled trials with economic evaluations of yoga. And there was a long program to think about complementary services. It's disruptive. It's trying to think about things that we actually are investing in, and do they represent value for money to us, even if the health system doesn't pay for it. But also, is there an argument that they should be subsidized? So for example, one of my studies was on self-hypnosis for pain in pregnancy, right? So that could fall on either sides of, I would pay that for myself, I just go and explore that, right? Or we could say to the health systems, we want to invest in that. I think those are starting to treat us like real consumers and to start accessing our, wants and needs, which I think, again, talk back to the S word that you were mentioning.
So I totally agree. I think valuing our brain, part of it is, even if we value it, but there's still so much stigma for people to realize there's things I can do. So that's where, the information and a lot of this group is trying to get people to realize, value it because you are the controller, the architect of your brain. Ryan, I want to know if you have some questions, because you're another part of our team for Brainomics, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but his wife teaches yoga, and here he is, come from here. So I thought you're the perfect person to ask sort of a question.
Question is, where do you find the biggest gaps in the literature? Where would you like to see the most attention paid from scholars in the area of the economics of brain health?
So my biased opinion, so I'm just going to reiterate because I think there might have been, where would I put most of my effort? I'm biased. I'm very into doing real-world, pragmatic, randomized controlled trials. So I think that I position them as policy experiments. We get investment to simulate what we might want to be in the system one day. And if with my analysis, or firstly, the clinical analysis is shown to be effective, but with my analysis it's shown to be cost-effective and even cost-saving, we leave the system no choice to change. And so that small but incremental steps, as we were having a discussion the other day, not big, massive ideas, but small systems. So that's a cultural shift that, having spent my postdoctoral period in York, and now I'm in Ireland, I'm really trying to drive that agenda forward in Ireland, because we don't have that yet. And I think it's fair to say that it's an emerging area in the States as well. So hopefully some of this idea would inspire others. So I think if we can get people into these kind of trials, I think it's actually the future of the health service. I'll tell you a personal story. My mother had breast cancer, okay? And she was in a trial. She was followed up every 6 months for 5 years. That consistency of being seen in a research arm has now, really gave her reassurance and gave her a lot of things like that. So now one of the things that we campaign for is 1 in 5 people get into a cancer study in the UK, whereas 1 in something like 20 get into a dementia study, which is, it's showing us that we need to redistribute our resources. So if we get the opportunity to meet the bright minds like we have in the room, and that's part of our care pathway, isn't that going to be a great system to be part of?
value your brain.
Thank you.
So, with the idea that the brain is the parts of the body and the mind which controls, the movement and action and brings it into, you could say, bring it to life. And so, in terms of the different, like dementia and the different diseases, and also, the way that we process our thoughts and the actions that we take. Like when you're doing your research on, in terms of, like how the way the culture is, and people always like listening, because I don't know if ones are aware the differentiation between the physical thing, the brain, and the mind that controls it, and our actions, and when the thoughts are coming, and like the mind, dementia, so you're really talking about the physical.
Yes.
The physical thing.
Versus,
and,
yeah.
Okay, and so the effect of what the mind has on the brain, I wanted to kind of, have you done any research in that area because for myself, when you say what makes you value your brain, I would say like the mind and my awareness and able to be the master of my mind.
Yeah.
Because the physical thing, I would say like the body and the thing that I feed it would be the way that I would value things, but I wanted to know about, because when I observe the culture and I see like the things that are happening in the world, and I don't know if ones are differentiating between the mind, the thing that controls the brain, and the actions, and the different diseases that cause one to do different actions.
Yeah.
So in your research, have you noticed?
It's a really good kind of conversation that you bring up there. I think it brings up a lot of thoughts with me. I mean, one is like, what is the difference between the mind and the brain? I think is one of the points that you're making. And I think it's a sense of self, right? And so I'm a social scientist, so economics is a part of social science. And I think in other branches of that, we've thought about that. So through the networks that we have in GBHI, there's a growing group that think about personhood. Like who are you? Who is that? And putting that at the forefront. So it kind of lends itself to this idea of patient-centered or person-centered service. So that I think one of the points that you're talking to is like there's a physical brain that's just treated medically versus who you are and I think that's a really important thing that as we're trying to do research, we need to think about. So this idea of having those people around the table in the multidisciplinary team, and one of those being someone who's living with dementia, for example, having equal voice and is on the same eye line as the physicians, as the economist, as the statisticians, all of them, and has equal voice and is trying to say, the point you're raising is important to me. Let's not just rush forward to breakthroughs and what might be important in the clinical or an academic setting, but also think about me as a consumer. So I think that's the really, really strong point that you're making. I mean, there's a lot more that I think we could talk about, but maybe we take that up over lunch. Yeah. Thanks.
You showed those couple of charts talking about like a setting for kind of a checkup for your brain.
Okay.
And you said that there's a couple of places that are putting that into place or testing that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe even tell us where are some of those examples, because I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
This one, yeah. So this is a kind of a blueprint of what Craig Ritchie. So again, we were talking a bit about the work that's been done on with Davos. Craig Ritchie's linking in with them to think about the agenda for prevention, and to think about the clinicians aren't going to wait till the diagnosis has come. That's not going to work. So they're into this new paradigm of thinking about, well, what should the service look like? And so this is a blueprint, and I think it's not the only one. There's a few people coming up with ideas. So I would say that the idea for location could be anywhere. Where are your blood pressure checks most effective? Let's work that out. If we put them in the hospital, maybe we get a certain, worried well population who are motivated to go there. Right? You familiar with it? Is that a term you use over here as well? Worried well. It's the, the highly motivated person who checks everything about themselves. But maybe when we put them on the high street, the person who really needs the intervention could get that opportunity and go, well, I wasn't going to do it, but I'll just pop in. It kind of bypasses that. So there is no specific, I think, but the mission is to reorganize that and not to make it a clinical model. And this is a person who's, from a clinical background, reflecting on their own experiences. Where is the opportunity to intervene earlier going to be placed? And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that here in the room, actually, with brain health.
I was wondering if there's any country that has started testing.
So this is Scotland.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Scotland. But I think we're trying to do it in Ireland as well. So some of my colleagues in Trinity are also thinking about brain health clinics. So that's taken a different approach. So it's kind of augmenting the memory clinic kind of setup and start to say, well, we have a spillover of people that would be the people that we'd. I think it relates to what Dr. Chapman would have told me. The people that you don't need us yet. Well, no, let's take you seriously now. Let's find a pathway. So these brain health clinics are connecting onto those. But this is pioneering, right? So I think we're in the right room. So again, I'm going to throw that back to you for people to throw ideas at me by email. So I'd love to hear them and simulate them.
Incredibly interesting talk.
Thank you.
I hope this isn't too general a question, but where would you say and it's a little bit more economically specific too, but where would you say the inelasticity of the healthcare demand curve kind of comes into all this? Mm-hmm. If that's too like general, I'm thinking in particular in the context of treating very specific conditions, treating things like dementia, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, whatever they might be, versus something that's more kind of general brain health and something that people who are, mm-hmm. either have disease or are well mm-hmm. can sort of engage in. I'm curious where you think that might, the effects that might have.
A simple question for someone who studied economics, I suppose. So inelasticity, for a point, is like how much can demand change if the demand, if prices were to change or some other factors change. That's how much they can vary. So for example, if we look at, let's say, fuel prices, we're wholly dependent on those, right? If the prices go up, they're probably quite inelastic. You still need to warm your home, those types of things, right? So we're always still going to have that demand. And I suppose the question is, where would that happen in healthcare? Where would the price continue to be able to rise? I think to bring it back to point on this topic, we've got some real pushes with price with the monoclonal antibodies, and that's really pushing the boundaries of what's inelastic, I think, to the furthest extreme. So what we've got there is a potential drug for a very rich subsection of society, and it shouldn't be something that governments should pick up the bill on. It's interesting to think where that goes, because I don't think it's inelastic, right? I think that you don't go, look, there's 55,000, I'm going to start mortgaging my home and stuff like that. People do that in health, right? We have these situations where we have catastrophic health expenditure. That's where someone will spend such a large proportion of their household income on health, or treating health, that it affects their own stability of the household. Those for me are situations where it's inelastic. You just say, I have to spend it. And we've got examples. In our fellowship group, one of our fellows has a very powerful story about his own family losing their home because they were having a father with early onset dementia. So I think I'm just trying to give you a round point. The more technical answers we can take up another time.
And there's a question in the back.
Yeah, I'll bring it back here, Paige, so you don't have to keep moving it around. What's interesting to me is, are we missing maybe an opportunity by leaving this in the domain of healthcare and insurance companies? Should we be talking about brain health as personal care? We buy a Mercedes-Benz for how much money? Mm-hmm. But in talking to Mr. Whithorn here from Wonder Health, there is price sensitivity to well-being models that are considered healthcare. Mm-hmm. People blanch at spending $9 a month on something that could improve their health. We may be missing the boat on priming that value and making brain health more valuable. Because Sandy talks about it. How much do you spend on your teeth? You get teeth whitening, you get dental care, but when people talk about $10 or $20 a month for brain health, they go, nah, that's too expensive. It's kind of laughable when you think about it. So I don't know if you're a Daniel Pink fan, but the book Nudge, you know, combining human behavior with what we're trying to do, I don't know.
So, interesting kind of cross-country comparison to bring up there, I suppose. You know, the States, which has a very free market dynamic when it comes to healthcare, versus the UK, which billionaires would not go privately because they like the NHS so much. It's a very strange, juxtapose between the two. I think to answer your question about that investment that people are, I think you're right. You know, I take the UK example that we expect everything to be paid for by a health budget. No, not at all. Like the example around, yoga, for example, that's something that we enjoy doing, we're prepared to pay for. And a variety of other things. There's a consumption thing going on there in a general market context. And so a lot of my work, and the reason I chose to, as an economist, specialize in this, is that it crosses across a lot of sectors. So it's not just healthcare. So like when you talk about mental health, a lot of my work would be in education, would be in criminal justice settings, would be in social care, and also a lot of it has direct relevance to how much tax is collected. So all of these things are saying that there are wider kind of considerations, hence the approach to measuring well-being as opposed to just this generic health approach. That kind of says, if it improves well-being, then it's just got a higher level value to society and not just to a specific budget. And I think the happiness and those other indexes can also say, would that be something that you'd be prepared to pay for yourself? And then we eventually come out of the frameworks we use and go back to cost-benefit types of approaches where we talk about willingness to pay. So I think for brain health, we need to do those types of studies. Let's establish what people are willing to pay for a set of hypothetical improvements in their brain health, given some simulation of what they might mean to them. So those kind of experiments are going to be useful so that we can kind of guide the market to develop and offer things that will sit quite well.
And we are almost at time, but we did have one question from our virtual audience. And it is, how can we get more definitive studies and information into the hands of the medical community so that they value brain health more?
So they value brain health more. So I'm working backwards from dementia, and I'm working with a lot of people who've specialized their careers around dementia. So I'm starting from there, and so some of the work I presented with these planes is something that I wanted to put out as a compendium, much like when we looked at the pipeline of products. I want it to be a repeating series like that. So that's going to be continually updated every year. And it's going to start off with dementia, and I hope over the 5 or 10 years, as people embrace this paradigm with me, it's going to start to have more, the balance is going to shift into brain health. So that compendium, hopefully, when we come back and talk again in 10 years' time, we'll say, well, look at the number of studies here that are falling in the bottom right quadrant that are to do with brain health interventions developed right here. So that's the intention. I think it's a really important question that clinicians should have that straight away. And I think the other half of that is to make sure that training is there, that people embrace this paradigm. If there are political persuasions say, or entities that say, let's not put cost per quality together, maybe people who in the academic senate should argue, say, no, we can see the value of that. It helps us to improve the system, not the services, but the system at a wider level.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trépel. I think each of us in this room and all of you on the virtual value the human mind, and I appreciate the question, the mind, the brain, as we think thoughts, it changes the brain, and to be able to make that real to people. And how do we do brain health promotion? Why is it the last thing we think about until something goes wrong? So we are flipping the script, removing stigma, so that people will be me, but better next year. If you want to be part of that, I hope you will join us in the Brain Health Project and see how far, how fit, how long. And I love some of the things you were saying, that just with regular coaching, just a little bit, helps people to stay on track. And that's what we're here for the Brain Health Project. So thank you so much. We're welcome to our family, Brainomics, health of brain, the economics of brain health, whatever we call it. You're part of our team now, right, Ryan? Yep. Right, team? So we're going to figure out the value of human brain health. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I look forward to receiving your ideas as well. So do continue the conversation either on Twitter or email me directly. Thank you.
And then join us February 3rd for our next on Music and the Brain, and see what we can do, and stay with us. And we will also, Brain Health Week is coming up. I hope you will join us. Take care.